Well, good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to everybody attending this seminar, both in person and online. My name's Margaret Hartley, and I'm a member of the ATSI Victorian Division Committee, and I'll be moderating this evening. Unfortunately, your scheduled moderator, Professor Bronwyn Fox, is unable to be with us tonight, having developed symptoms yesterday, so she's now home isolating, awaiting COVID test results. I know Bronwyn's watching the event, so I know we all wish her well, and we also wish her a very negative test result. My hopes it's just a sore throat. I would certainly like to start the evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. For me, this is the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. Melbourne's always been a significant gathering place for groups of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge and respect their continuing connection with the land. A little bit about the format tonight is that after I introduce our two fantastic speakers, they will present for about 10 to 15 minutes, and each of them will then join in a panel discussion on the issues that are raised. And for those watching online, if you ask questions, please use the Q&A function available to you, and the Q&A questions are being monitored and will be asked during the panel discussion. For housekeeping, can those present also make sure your mobile phones are either turned off or on silent? And I also just want to remind everybody to be aware that this meeting is being recorded and will be published on the Academy's YouTube channel. As part of just introducing the topic about are we ready for a hydrogen revolution, I don't think the timing could be any better to ask the question. Today, Minister Price, the Minister for Science and Technology, announced a $60.2 million Global Science and Technology Fund, which included a collaboration funding on hydrogen production in an effort to drive a strategy of Australia as a major player in hydrogen by 2030. So I'm pleased to note that ATSI, in collaboration with the Academy of Science, will administer about 18.2 million of this fund as strategic elements and mainly grants. So that's the interest that's going on always. And of course, there's when any innovation is before you, there are key issues of what actually is the global landscape. So we would welcome engagement globally. What opportunities are there for Australia and how do we harness these opportunities? And I guess what is our appetite and readiness for being a technology leader? And I'm sure our speakers will tackle some of these big issues in their talk. I'd just like to introduce both of them now because they will hand to each other during the talk. Fiona Simon, great to have you here, who's the CEO of the Australian Hydrogen Council, the peak body for the Australian hydrogen industry. Fiona, not only in leading a forming group of industries around the Hydrogen Council, has had over 20 years experience working in energy policy and regulation, specialising in energy retail competition and consumer protection, a skill set highly suitable for an emerging new energy industry sector. So welcome, Fiona. And Richard Bolt is currently a principal at NAS Group, and after a very distinguished career in the Victorian Public Service, where he led 3 departments over 12 years, Richard is now the Adjunct Professor of Energy Transformation at Swinburne University of Technology. And probably Richard is best known for his work in energy and decarbonisation policy, and was on the advisory panel for the National Hydrogen Strategy and chaired negotiations for the 500 million hydrogen energy supply chain pilot project. And he's also on the steering committee for the Net Zero Australia project. So I don't think we could have found two better speakers tonight. And I'd like to hand over to Fiona to tell us, are we ready? Thanks, Fiona.
Well, thank you, Margaret, for the very kind introduction. Thanks for having me here. So thank you to ATSI for having me, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. So the slide is up. Yes, the slide is up. So yes, as Margaret said, we're the peak body for the emerging clean hydrogen industry. We've got 95 members at the moment. We are growing every year. And our members are spread across sort of many sectors, that, you know, anything that's relevant to hydrogen. The main areas, though, are energy, transport, consulting and technology. So I thought it would be worth going into some basic points about hydrogen, but I know from some of the faces in the audience that you know this very well, so please indulge me. So I wanted to start with, well, why hydrogen? And so there's some basic points here, and I'll just touch on the top 3 characteristics that I have found resonated with me when I was first getting into this this pre-industry and trying to work out, you know, how to think about it. So first of all, we make it. We don't find it. I do acknowledge that there is gold hydrogen, but I'm not going to touch on that. So hydrogen is generally made, not found, which means we're not relying on limited resources or regions. So like electricity, it's an energy carrier, and like electricity, we can make it in different ways. And of course, the clean and the green versions are the longer term opportunity that everyone's very enthused about. And we make green hydrogen from renewable electricity and water via a piece of kit called an electrolyzer, and there's no inherent carbon footprint in its production or use. So hydrogen is also storable over time and transportable. So it exists as a gas or a liquid. It can be stored for long periods of time, and unlike batteries, not lose its energy value. That's where hydrogen can play a really important role in a range of areas, including as a firming measure for electricity grids. And it can be transported over long distances too. So, you know, truck, ship or pipeline that can help communities maintain access to energy. And it's also exportable as a result. And a lot of the value of hydrogen for Australia at the moment is in those export opportunities. So hydrogen is also my third main point, is that it's versatile. So it can be converted for different uses across energy, transport and industrial processes. It connects the sectors in new ways and provides additional economic resilience to the country. So in summary, hydrogen's key value relative to electricity and batteries is that it provides that longer term energy storage potential. It can be transported across space and time like current, natural gas and liquid fuels. And it's the perfect complement to variable electricity, variable renewable electricity and batteries, and that versatility allows it to connect to different sectors of the economy. And for Australia, a hydrogen industry does show particular promise. We have a great opportunity in the country to create a vibrant hydrogen industry, both for domestic and export use. So we've got the renewable energy resources, the technical skills and the track record with international partners to potentially become a global hydrogen leader. We'll come into later in the discussion what the challenges are, but this is all the opportunity. So the National Hydrogen Strategy says benefits to Australia from a clean hydrogen industry could be as high as $26 billion a year, an additional GDP by 2050, and close to 17,000 new jobs. And one of the measures of success in the strategy is that Australia is one of the top 3 exporters of hydrogen to Asian markets. And so the export of hydrogen and its derivatives provides us not only with an economic growth opportunity, but it's a way to evolve the resources and mining sectors and provide economic resilience again in a decarbonising world. So it does provide tangible opportunities to decarbonise our domestic energy system, including power generation, manufacturing and support and transport. And we're seeing great interest from the industry for hydrogen with over 80 projects around the country in various stages of development. Most are still small scale though, or on the pilot stage. The environment is busy though, and a source of constant announcements. And many of the projects that are being announced these days are investigating transport applications, so buses and trucks mainly, or they're looking at blending hydrogen into natural gas networks. I'm actually really pleased to see that there's been more about industrial use recently, so that's great. And many projects are also looking at multiple uses in order to get maximum value from production assets. So I'd certainly recommend, if you're interested in those projects, go to the website High Resource, HY Resource. It's hosted on the CSIRO website. It has all the current announced projects across the full asset lifecycle. It also releases periodic reports that provide a snapshot of the industry. We absolutely love it, so please do use it. We're also seeing we are seeing these green shoots appear. The activity is getting the hydrogen ball rolling. It'll help us work out where the best opportunities do lie. So if we switch to the next slide, please. Thank you. So given the options and the interlinkages and the need for scale across different markets, it can be a challenge to develop an objective picture of the industry and the likely sources of demand. So we use this diagram as an initial frame to describe how hydrogen can play a no regrets role in future decarbonisation. This is from a great report from the Energy Transitions Commission, although I have seen versions of this in a range of other ways. I just like this one more because it's a bit easier to digest. So this is plotting various end uses for hydrogen by the confidence that we can have as hydrogen having a role, so our need to use it to decarbonise, and our readiness to use it. So you can see here that the hydrogen uses toward the right along the x-axis reflect the stronger confidence, and uses higher up the y-axis axis reflects greater readiness. And if uses that rate well on both axes are up to the right at the top, with fertilizer as a key example. And I thought it'd be useful to unpack some of these applications a bit. And ideally, through the lens of manufacturing seems to be a good way of doing that. So hydrogen can support decarbonisation of manufacturing in two ways. First of all, as a fuel, where the hydrogen can produce heat through combustion or chemical processes. And that's through from food and meat processing, glass manufacturing. And it's also replacing natural gas for much of these applications. And it will do this where electricity as a way of substituting for natural gas doesn't quite stack up technologically or economically. It's also used as a feedstock. So hydrogen is already used as a feedstock for several industrial processes, including the manufacture of ammonia. And this is less about its energy value. So it's not about potentially using electricity or batteries, but it's a specific way that hydrogen plays a chemical role. So if we look at the potential role for hydrogen in manufacturing in the figure, we can see at the top right, we're looking at manufacturing fertilizer and methanol. So these are already produced with hydrogen, so they are both dependent and ready. And moving down the readiness scale to steel, this is where hydrogen can be used as a replacement for natural gas to reduce iron ore. And the resulting iron, so direct reduced iron, can then go through an electric arc furnace powered by renewable electricity. And again, the alternatives to hydrogen aren't really there. And while using scrap steel instead of iron ore is definitely a worthy approach, there isn't enough scrap to feed the steel industry of the future. So this area of the economy is highly reliant on hydrogen, but it's not particularly ready. There are major technological changes and major investments required to go green. If we move across to shipping and aviation, this is about the manufacturing of fuels for future aircraft and for ships. That'll need to be low to zero emissions rather than using existing bunker or aviation fuels. So low carbon shipping in the future might be run on hydrogen. It's more likely to be run on ammonia, and methanol is in there as well. So all of these industries have growth potential in their clean and green versions. So they do provide new opportunities for global markets for Australia to export to, as well as allowing us to decarbonise local industry. And achieving scale and hydrogen production for these sectors can then pave the way for other industries, such as the high temperature heating category, the food processors, for example, the glass manufacturers, and there was a crematorium, I think, in Victoria. We can see here that there's a medium confidence for hydrogen and high temperature heat processes with a low readiness, but having the benefit of scale to reach these applications would ideally boost the readiness factor and support the businesses in this diverse group that do need to shift to hydrogen. And related to manufacturing, certainly when it comes to logistics, we have the heavy duty trucking application. That's the HDV yellow trucking blob in the middle. And that indicates a medium reliance on hydrogen and medium readiness. And so this is really about replacing diesel, which is the main fuel for larger trucks and buses. And the CSIRO and other observers have noted that hydrogen's round about reach price parity with diesel. So diesel does present a clear near-term opportunity for hydrogen sector development. And we can also look at applying all uses of diesel, including remote aero power systems and for trains. And obviously it's also about replacing diesel from a public health perspective. It is a good thing to take those pollutants out of the system. So while we do expect batteries to play a role in heavy transport to replace diesel, the economics are still a bit unclear, and the heavier uses with the longer ranges do seem far more dependent on an energy dense fuel like hydrogen. So I've only covered a few of the applications on the list, and the list itself is also far from exhaustive. And in fact, hydrogen businesses and business ideas are springing up everywhere. People are seeing the opportunities. And so it's a great time. It's a time of great enthusiasm and innovation and experimentation. And I haven't even touched on the technological advances that are being made regarding alternative means of making and storing hydrogen, because they certainly exist. But this is just us painting a picture of the key hydrogen uses that we know now, where we can see that even if all we did was use hydrogen for industrial applications and as a heavy transport fuel, that's a huge part of the global economy. It's hard enough. and it probably should be enough, but that's my personal view. I will close there and hand over to Richard, who I'm very much looking forward to having a discussion with. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you to Etsy and Come to the Library. Lovely to see some very familiar faces in the room, and to acknowledge that there are some very capable minds on the subject of hydrogen and energy more generally here. So I will be suitably humble in promoting my views. Patrick, why are you laughing? Sorry for the people online. That was just an in-the-room joke. Look, and thank you to Fiona. That was a great overview. Very good. And I'll riff off it and disagree only at the margins with some things, but essentially I think we're very lined up in our thinking. I did want to start by looking at the wider picture of decarbonisation. So if you're thinking about readiness, it's difficult to talk about readiness and to assess readiness without asking what are the vital preconditions for a hydrogen economy. And they can look quite daunting, and I'm not going to try and sugarcoat that reality. Not doing it is also daunting, but there is an element of the magnitude of the task is arresting when you face it head on. So I'll start with a number of observations that hopefully are coherent on that point. So achieving net zero emissions by 2050, now an increasingly Western or at least industrialised economy target, stretching out to 2070 for India. It means that if you take 2050 as our goal, it means we have to do the job as far as Australia goes, a total decarbonisation job in half the investment side, in terms of highly capital intensive industries, which we are mostly talking about. Energy, the chemical industry, the minerals industry, the transport sector generally operate on technologies that have quite a long lifetime. It must be done, thinking globally now, as the global population grows to maybe 9 billion and living standards rise, which is a pretty legitimate expectation, particularly in Africa and India. Some countries of very notable size, China in particular, have to stay this course while navigating a rapid workforce decline. So the Chinese population is, I think, already in decline, and its workforce is about to take a precipitate dive. And that is just an economic context which will have an impact on the ability to invest in rebuilding an industrial system in which you don't get necessarily more amenity from it, you simply get more sustainability from it. I think we'd also say relevantly here, when social licence matters in such a profound change, the trust in our political institutions, both democratic and autocratic, I'd argue, will be seriously tested, and from a fragile starting point. Now, why would you think that the starting point of flow to realise just how insecure those leadership regimes are? Productivity growth has declined, certainly in Australia and the West in general, for quite some time. It's declined to the point where it's more or less flatlined, and it's quite modest, right? So we're not talking about having a massive economic surplus and a huge opportunity for rising living standards to be devoted to this, and at the same time still improve our material standards of living. It's becoming tempting to say that we might have to reset some of our expectations as to how we live. Not to say that we're going to live as paupers, but more that the notion of constant growth, opportunities may not be the outlook when we have to do this as well. That might be a very important debating point. And it will put more emphasis on the importance of redistribution rather than growth for all, in which we can paper over inequalities because everyone's getting something. It's worth bearing in mind the Steven Pinker finding that while global equality has certainly risen, and that's essentially due to rising wealth in China and some other parts of the world to a lesser extent, equality within pretty well every country has generally declined since the 70s. So that tension will potentially play out as we share the carbon budget globally and within countries, within our demographic realities, so to speak. So decarbonisation will also have to be driven over many political cycles, and I am to an extent kind of shuffling back to the point about democratic and autocratic regimes and their ability to manage this. There are many political cycles and many geopolitical schisms for which there's no obvious end in sight, and we have to actually kind of stay this course while dealing with invasions of Ukraine, with what's happening to the Uyghurs, etc., etc. Climate change will continue while decarbonisation has to gather pace. Now, that should strengthen political will, or all else being equal, to do something, but it will also complicate the task in certain respects. So I'd say in general, the economic and political challenge is widely underestimated. And I'm not here to say, therefore, we should just give up and go home. You know, as Fred Dagg or John Clark once famously put it, just run down to the beach and put a wave over our bonds. That's not actually the kind of conclusion I would draw. It's more a case of, let's get serious about how big this is. Let's not over-egg it. Let's not overhype it. Let's just face it. And I think in facing it and planning better for it, might have some painful moments, but we might have a better result in the long term. Most plans will only get us some of the way, is what I'd be saying. There's a lot of incompleteness. Much commentary assumes away challenges, or in some cases just wildly overstates them, and we need to be somewhere more mature and nuanced in between those two things. And I'll finish this broad overview by saying something about net zero targets, which I think is important, because it's often possible to think you can externalise this problem away of making this all happen. How can you do it? Well, offsets. Let's go offsets. You know, let's do as much as we can, then we'll go offsets. And so I guess I'm here to offer the possibly controversial view that the net zero targets, or net zero targets generally, are going to have to be more zero than net. And why would you say that? The net implies that offsets will mop up the emissions we can't reduce. But when you think about it, both for political and just for basic economic and technical reasons, when global zero is the goal, the use of land for revegetation is really subject to a lot of competition for the use of that land. And revegetation in general, and I'm talking very generically about forms of sequestration in our natural systems, is temporary and a relatively risky solution, particularly in the context of climate change. So I would posit that offsets will be a small and diminishing share of the solution, rather transitory. And if we think that that's going to get us there, then we're deluding ourselves. It goes back to the point, let's be real. So let's get to hydrogen. Shift to a hydrogen economy comprises on some measures a minority share of the decarbonisation task, but in terms of complexity, cost and value, it's a very large share. It's probably pointless to argue which is the most important, because when you're going for zero, they're all important if they're significant. But the preconditions are still worth remembering. So replacing coal-fired power with renewables, bearing in mind renewables are such an important source of hydrogen into the future, replacing coal-fired power with renewables in most parts of the world is the first priority. It's gathering pace, but we can't go off into a massive green hydrogen explosion in areas in which people live and loads are large, until we've actually done the low-hanging fruit of getting coal out of the grid. Electrifying many uses of oil and gas, with heat pumps, electric vehicles in particular, is expected to make a large contribution. That will also have to be supplied before we get to hydrogen. Not to say that we're going to be absolutely sequential and say we will do nothing on green hydrogen anywhere until all of that is done. Well, of course not. We will walk down both tracks at once. And there are some parts of the world with quite stranded renewable resources, the two would be notable in Australia's setting, where you can get going quite early, and we should. Decarbonizing agriculture, and I hesitate to draw fire from Robin Batterham when I say this, but which is essentially reducing methane from the mouths of cows. That's essentially the task, right? Is perhaps the hardest task of all, to which of course hydrogen has no application. So there's some context there which just put hydrogen in its place, but that still leaves some hard to abate tasks, to use the term of art, for which hydrogen is by far the most prospective answer. And as Fiona said, heavy and long distance transport, high grade industrial heat, inputs to key chemical processes are top of this list. And that was essentially, I think, your top several, and I agree. I would be a little more optimistic about the use of hydrogen for some applications that have effectively been written off as electrification has won. When you're talking highly utilised car, van and truck fleets that return to base, that have very high duty cycles, that can tolerate very low refuelling or recharging times, in which the amount of infrastructure you need is quite minimal, I actually think hydrogen could end up being fairly competitive. Taxi fleets, commercial van operations, trucking operations, and so forth. Equally, when you take heat pumps into the realms of very large residential towers and communities used to communal heating, which is common in Europe, or at least reasonably common in Europe, then I think, again, the economies of scale that are possible, the densities of hydrogen and its value as a heating source might mean that they end up hydrogen fired as well. So I don't think it's an absolutely clear thing. Not every residential or domestic use is small scale standalone housing and private vehicles that almost do no service at all. That's not the way the world is going to go. Mobility as a service, for example, is of course one of those terms of art in transport planning, and I've done a bit of work in transport, and I would have thought hydrogen has a role to play there potentially. And may the best win. These are areas where we do not need too much central planning. I think that choices can actually drive it in the end. I would say in passing, social license would be a significant issue. At the moment that the gas gets to the voter, if I can put it that way, then you're going to start having some serious explaining to do as to what the risks are. I don't think that's impossible to resolve, but it's remarkable how many quite knowledgeable people would raise their eyebrows at the thought. I would say that the social licence matter hasn't really been dealt with adequately yet, and that is for the future. Now, I better take a time check. Margaret, are you wanting to shut me down? Am I keep going for a little bit? Okay, I will keep going. I would say, I mean, Fiona talked about readiness. She put up that that chart, and that was, I've got nothing to add to that. That's a good, very succinct overview. The only thing I'd say to add to that is that imported technology is key to our readiness. When you think this is a challenge born global, you know, we are not going to be, for the most part, manufacturing our own hydrogen production or use technologies here, which is not because we're an incompetent economy. It's because we're 25 million people in a massive global workforce and industrial system. And it just makes sense that in the end, when you have complexities of supply chains and complexities of technology, that we will be buying more than we sell. We, however, will probably be exporting more of the fuel than we use, which I'll come to. Now, fertilizer, I would like to spend more time on because it's the unsexy aspect of hydrogen use, which I'm becoming increasingly convinced is worth more focus than we give it. And that is essentially because our food security is highly dependent on the use of artificial fertilizers, and particularly nitrogenous fertilizers in the form of urea, principally, if not exclusively. And most of the current production of urea is emissions intensive. In fact, it all is really. And almost none is made here. Remarkably, for a massive industrial agricultural economy, we make almost none of our own fertilizer. Most of it is made in our very friendly and dependable trading partners such as China and Russia. And that has to be, on top of the fact that there are emissions that we could abate here, not our emissions, this is effectively displacing emissions overseas. There's also an unarguable economic security imperative, but there's also potentially just a basic business case. The price of gas is high. The likelihood is it will stay high. The world is not investing, and the certainty involved in investing in new supplies of gas in the context of net zero thinking is not very good, is not very high. And so there's a chance, a fairly high chance of a continued just-in-time approach to bringing gas into production, because we will need to keep bringing it into production for quite some time, but we may not bring it in so quickly and so voluminously that the price is kept or driven down to previous levels. That is a very good commercial signal for urea to be made here from processes that are more emissions friendly, and particularly, I have to tell you, from brown coal in Victoria, which is completely immune to international pricing. And those arguments apply more broadly to ammonia, which has both existing and very new uses, as Fiona outlined some of those, including as a fuel for shipping, as a means of export, as well as for some things that we already use it for. So there is quite an opportunity there to conceive of hydrogen as a chemical industry first and foremost, and an energy industry second. Now, if Australia, in terms of the readiness debate, also needs to focus on exports. We are a huge exporter, as we all know, of coal and liquefied natural gas. The general view, though there are some contests to this, is that Northern Hemisphere countries with low resources and high populations, big economies, will struggle to meet their own needs under net zero, and we have an opportunity to replace our emissions-intensive exports with something a lot better, which is hydrogen-based fuels made cleanly. And with ammonia being the likely carrier of choice, although that jury is still out. The thing about this that is worth really focusing on when you're talking readiness is that readiness of technology is only one very small part of it. It is readiness to build the massive amounts of capacity that would be involved in producing anything like the volumes of coal and LNG of energy that we now export. And Robin is the chair of the Net Zero Australia project that I sit on the steering committee of, which is headlined, if you like, by Melbourne and Queensland unis, with Princeton Uni and the Nous Group also playing roles. And early results, which I won't go into here because they're still the steering committee's property, if you like, would show just how big the task is. But I think it's, look, I've done calculations on this separately for another project involving offshore wind in Victoria, and the total electricity generation that we would see in Australia to maintain some kind of parity with export volumes of energy would be tens of times historical levels of electricity. And with what you would call a very low area density of production of renewable energy, is, you know, you look at a forest of wind turbines and you look at a power station using coal and you think, oh, they're about the same size, they must be about the same capacity. Well, there's no comparison. They are very much less. And I think I might have made this point at the last forum. The point being that the land use change involved in the deployment of all of this renewable power, solar and wind, and all the transmission that needs to actually carry it from one place to another is going to be an enormous readiness challenge that we've got to actually plan for and face. And at the moment, I think we don't really have the database to do that. I think Net Zero Australia, under Robin's wise leadership, ought to be provide a lot of illumination on that point. Final thing I was going to mention, and I am almost finished, is that hydrogen production is the focus of polarised debate. And whenever I raise this, Fiona has the very strong visceral impulse to just run out of the room, which she's not doing, but I'm sure she would like to. So this is the question of green versus blue. Do people know, I mean, I know some people here know the green versus blue question. Green hydrogen is the kind of hydrogen you make when you use renewable power to split water with electrolysis. And blue hydrogen is what you get, or is the term applied to gasifying coal or reforming methane to produce hydrogen and a CO2 stream, which is then sequestered. So that the actual emissions, the net emissions arising are quite small, but non-zero, as they say. And I think I'd just say that this debate is a symptom of a problem of readiness, in that we tend to have a very polarised, ideological, almost football-like debate about whether you're for the blue team or the green team. And it really is only a football league of two, right? The Australian Hydrogen League has two teams with one colour each. And at the moment, you would be forgiven for believing that it is a head-on-head contest, whereas in reality, the most important way of looking at this is to say, especially as we see the consequences of the current energy crunches that are happening around the world, it's all hands on deck, guys. Let's make sure we promote everything and we use them in a synergistic way and think about the interactions, complementarities of them, more than we think about the idea that one is going to win entirely over another. Overall, green has to dominate in the long run. I can't see any other way around that. It's a circularity problem. It is also a social acceptance problem. But most of all, it's the least raw and finite resources, and we are talking here about a system that has to effectively last indefinitely. So it should win in terms of dominance, but I think there is going to be a role for blue in getting it moving. There's going to be a role for blue in supporting the variability of green through cycles of low renewable output and into seasonal transfers, because the one thing you cannot do with green is dictate when you make it. You make it when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, and you don't have full control over that. It is seasonal, it is fickle, it is very important, but it needs some backup. And I'm going to just finish on that point and say that planning, honest engagement, serious investment, and taking the next step, but also doing it with a very clear sense of where you're going to be in 10, 20, and 30 years' time is the real readiness challenge we have, and we're only beginning to grapple with it. Thank you.
Going to change a bit of pace and have a bit of a panel discussion and invite audience participation as violently as you like, and also we've got someone monitoring the Q&As online. I might just kick off, Richard and Fiona, for you is I think the complexity that's come through about what we're dealing with, and And it's not just about technology. It's probably going to be about government policy and social license to operate and skills that we have in-house, and that we're not going to be the innovators on everything about hydrogen. So what's the best bets we've got to be leaders, and also where will we be collaborators? And still, Robin always taught me that if you collaborate with really brilliant people, you can share the risk, and it's a really good idea. But de-risk both parties, and there's benefit in collaboration, but be it in another country or something. So, do you want to just make a comment about what you think are our best bets?
Oh, you go first.
Well, I'd like to pick up that collaboration theme, right? Because amongst our best bets, I think is that Australia is exceptionally skilled at integrating technologies into large-scale production systems. We give ourselves a whack often as being a kind of backwards resource economy, like all we do is just take shovels and break ground. In reality, you only have to look at the Rio Tinto operations, and I know Rio Tinto has had its very black marks in some of its operation, in some of what it's done in the Pilbara, to Aboriginal heritage in particular. But nonetheless, the sophistication with which they have developed a production system and a control system, you know, that essentially is housed at Perth Airport is a wonder to behold. Now, that is by definition highly collaborative, both within the Australian setting and internationally. And I think one of our strengths is that I think we can become a very reliable, skilled integrator of technologies into mass production systems for our and also international benefit. So that's one thing I think is a big bet for Australia. And I don't think there's too much argument about that, actually. It's generally going to be true. The other thing is that we do, I think, have the ability to, if we really apply ourselves to it, to honestly face the future and to make some very, very good choices. But there we've got to rediscover something we used to be better at, which is strategic planning of the kind which is practical, but at the same time genuinely visionary and unblinkered by ideological preferences. And I would say that our political and public service systems have declined in that regard and need to rediscover a past strength. There's two ideas.
And mainly from your industry, Peter, but also your background in regulation and having seen the energy system work, the traditional energy system, if you like.
I think we really do have the ingredients to do something meaningful. But I'm genuinely concerned about, I agree absolutely with Richard. I'm genuinely concerned about Australia's ability to then rally the troops and actually get our act together in time in a system which is so fragmented. So even if we're talking about the academic institutions, that they're incentivized to compete and end up, unfortunately, probably looking at some of the same questions, but not realizing that each other are doing it. The industry does that all the time. The state governments are competing with one another. And if you also lack national leadership to help you actually understand where you're going and what the milestones are to get there, if you lack some kind of reasonable data that people can draw on more generally to understand, the net zero piece, and gosh, I'm looking forward to seeing Net Zero Australia release its work. If we lack all that, then we're relying on fortune. We're relying on individuals who happen to have the gumption to get something done, and I think that's awfully risky. So we've got the land. Now, the land comes with massive caveats. I agree again with Richard. I'm not assuming, I don't think we should be assuming we have access to all that land. We have issues with water. Now, not necessarily in every state, not necessarily even an issue that can't be managed. I mean, there's desalination, there's wastewater, but there could be a serious public perception of how we're thinking about water with hydrogen. I'm actually much more concerned right now about the fact that we don't have bodies. We don't have a workforce. People can't even get things built now, let alone how we're going to have a workforce to actually build all of that renewable energy and build everything we need for hydrogen. So these are the inputs to hydrogen are not easy to manage if we don't tackle them with a strong sense of urgency and that ability, as Richard was saying really eloquently, more eloquently than me, but just coming to grips with the size of this thing. So I do struggle a bit because I have both a highly optimistic view and some might say, negative view. I call it realism, but, realistic view about the fact that we've got all these ingredients, but if we continue to lack the cook who's going to put it together or the kitchen to do it, and, you can stretch that analogy as far as you want, but those ingredients just sit there. And so we really do need to be relying on more than short-term market and government and media views to get a long-term, massive scale, serious international collaboration piece up.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take a question. I see Robin Banahan's got his hand up, and then I'll go to Q&A question. Robin.
Thanks to both of you for a splendid run through on the topic of readiness and hitting on all sorts of things. And if I was left with just one takeout on the whole thing, it's that it's a very big challenge. How we make that happen. Yeah. And I wonder if in covering the ground that we've covered tonight, where without well, I wonder if there's enough I don't know how to get it. Rather than wouldn't be better now, I'm using a meta-analysis to say, how do we mobilize for the investment focus by providing the mega opportunity that you both are referring to in this time?
Can I?
You're going to need strategy, aren't you?
Yeah. I think the money has to drive everything. So then where are the incentives for people to invest? So that's where government policy has to come in and say, this is how, this is how our society or our economy will value things. I don't know if we're going to say, actually, we're going to mobilise shareholders. The question is, well, what do they actually care about? I would like to think that they would care about more than making money. We are seeing ESG, growing, but are we going, again, that's a patchwork approach. Are we going to see a cumulative effect of shareholder activism that is going to get the action that we need in time?
But what about this government activism? What I'm thinking of is superannuation funds run under a marvellous little tax break. As long as they follow certain rules of investment, then they operate with very essentially in a tax-free environment. What about if added to that is something like, if you invest in demonstrably low emission, whatever it is, you get a bonus tax break.
I think all of these are potential levers for governments to pull. And, ideally you'd want the levers that have the greatest bang for buck to be pulled, but you can have all sorts of combinations, and why not? These are all the things that we try to advocate for to governments. I think what I continue to find, though, is that governments aren't really incentivised to want to do those things, and they have their own, the politics to deal with. Definitely, so I was going to say, definitely the investment piece is vital. To be honest, I'm relying more on other countries' concerns about their energy security and their determination to do something about their fundamental immediate issues, coming to Australia and saying, for God's sake, please give us the ammonia, please give us what we need. That's actually, I think the urgency comes from that, not in the hope that people will behave well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm probably a bit more optimistic that values will ultimately become more pervasive, but I don't think, and so will drive a readiness to take the right kind of action. But incentives, I think, as Robin is saying, and I think you're agreeing, are still required. And the thing that I probably didn't say at the outset that I meant to say was, I haven't seen ever, I don't think there's any case in history where such a profound industrial transformation has been driven as a public good. When you think about it, does the industrial revolution anything like that? No, it wasn't. That was obviously governments were pretty heavily involved, but it was the pursuit of wealth and greater material standards, and a wonderful thing that was. But it wasn't trying to solve for some massive economic externality or environmental externality that come out of a production system that we thought we had to correct for, even though our living standards here and now wouldn't be better off for it. That's what this is. And it's going to require a huge reallocation of workforce effort, of capital, compared to the current trends and proportions to which they're devoted. And that is going to require certain kinds of investment to be privileged over certain others that currently aren't. And there's no doubt there has to be a role for government to guide that, while at the same time playing its role of persuader and facilitator, you know, building the team spirit as well as kind of directing stuff. Governments that try to over-direct, as we can see through COVID, can actually find themselves short of a lot of support and retreating rapidly into the world of everyone do what they like. So, and this of course won't play out with anything like the compressed timescales of COVID, but governments are going to have to calibrate their interventions for the degree of the legitimacy that they gain from that, from the publics that vote for them and from the companies that comment on what they do. So it's going to be a dance between communities and the public, and also communities, and I mean that in a local and also a cohort sense, because there'll be classes of people with different interests. It's not just a homogenous kind of view on this. You know, people might like decarbonisation in principle, but they do not always like it in practice. And in fact, that is really playing out, for example, a lot of transmission lines that are being built to bring renewable power to major loads. They are all running into trouble for that reason. So it is a dance. It is a dance of communities in a plural sense with different interests that need to be integrated with our political system, which are also quite pluralistic in both the, you know, the parties and the independents and the different levels of government and the electorates, and of course the private sector, which is a non-homogenous beast of its own. And that to me is the problem there is that is a very complex dance, and it's time is not our friend here if we take literally the kind of targets we're setting for ourselves. So yes, governments are going to have to show some direction. They're also going to have to test the waters to see just how far they can go. And that has been politics forever, and it will continue to do.
I'll go to the Q&A and then
There's lots of questions coming through on the Q&A, but I'll start with one that's for you, Fiona, which talks about the chart that you put up and argues that it might apply particularly to higher northern latitude economies. The question asks whether for low latitude countries, and in particular Australia, this chart might look quite different. Power storage and heating might be absent as possibly co-firing, with the result that gas blending might also not be needed. Do you think we need to redraw the chart for low latitude countries, including Australia?
Oh, the good news is it has been redrawn for lower latitude countries, and in fact, like Australia, it just wasn't as easy to absorb as the one I put up on the screen. So that was a global chart. Often when I have more time, I show the next chart, which is based on work that Advisian did for the Clean Energy Finance Corporation that was released in May last year. That was looking at, you know, the same sorts of sectors, understandably, and they're rating them out of 10 as to their readiness, and also rating them based on our needs to decarbonise. And what the point I draw out when I have that more time is to say, here is the Australian version, and it's largely the same. Now, I would say that the questions about gas blending are probably as relevant in Victoria as they are in some northern climates. And I would say the benefits and the criticisms are likely to be the same wherever you are, if you're looking at a large population using current natural gas.
Yep. There's a related question here I'll ask, and then you can go around the room a bit more. So somebody's also querying whether your graph accounts for the difficulty and expense of storing and transporting hydrogen compared to petrol, diesel and LPG, or the safety issues. Hydrogen is odorless and burns with a nearly invisible flame, so you can't see its escape and it's burning, unlike other common fuels.
Yes, we know that. I couldn't comment on, I don't have the energy. I would advise anyone who's interested, Google the Energy Transitions Commission report, and you can discover yourself what their assumptions were. I would say it was purely around industrial readiness to do something, as in, do the systems apply right now? You know, do we have the ability to do large scale direct reduced iron and the electric arc furnaces to make green steel? No, we don't, but it's highly reliant on hydrogen. Like, it was that kind of assessment, I would imagine, but I wouldn't want to speak to the detail of someone else's report. Safety, you wouldn't have covered safety. Safety doesn't mean it's not an issue, but I think if we're expecting one chart to rule them all, I haven't yet found it. So, yeah.
And as far as oil and gas goes, of course, that's a tantamount to say we're not going to decarbonise. So it's not really about a comparison. It's hydrogen versus something else that is equally capable of getting net
It's
zero.
energy. You know, it's going to do something if you mishandle it.
Thank you. Yes. Yes. Do you speak up? I think we'll be all right.
I'll give it a go. Thanks, though. Thanks for a great talk, both of you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, but we can hear you. But
No one else. Really well. So, Richard, you mentioned in your talk a number of schisms in different parts of the hydrogen story, and we talked about the need for strategy and all hands on deck. We're very familiar in the Australian energy system with political schisms.
Mm.
Where are we with that? Is it changing? Which way is it going, if it is?
Look, the overall trend is pretty uniformly, since the repeal of carbon pricing, toward a greater and greater acceptance that this is just something that must be dealt with, at least for political reasons. Not always necessarily with absolute personal conviction, but I mean, I'd probably say as an editorial sidebar that the act or the culture of political management these days is to offer a view of what the future might look like, and then to listen very closely to how your electorate's responding and move very quickly to absorb the pressures that come from that in order to stay in power. Conviction matters a hell of a lot less nowadays than winning the next election, and the volatility of voters and their willingness to change sides is probably key to all of that. So I think overall it's going in the right direction slowly, but it doesn't, you know, having aspirations is very different to having real plans. And that's where, to pick up Fiona's point, which I've also made, is the planning is at this stage, you would say, rudimentary. It is, and even on the sides that would say we are much more in favour of this, it is still well short of a full acceptance of the gravity, the size, the scale, the complexity, the risk and all that of the task. And I think one of the reasons I was attracted to take part in Net Zero Australia as a project is that I'd kind of formed the view that it is extremely difficult for governments these days, both because of their cognitive competence, if I can, and that's not to be pejorative, but it's just a reality, but also because of the strictures that they are placed in by the political culture that they don't themselves control. Right? It's controlled by the public. That for anyone to stand up and own a complete program to 2050 is tantamount to writing a resignation letter. And therefore, it really does behove the world of research, advocacy, to use non-taxpayer funded sources to offer some directions and some ideas for the future that don't get caught up in the need to win that next election. And I think that's why what we're doing is particularly important to the future of the debate. And it's a missing piece in Australia.
I've got a few questions in the room and I was so conscious of there. So we'll try and keep the answers a bit shorter so we can get as many done. I've got Sally first, and then Matthew, and then we'll go to Q&A. Sorry.
I wanted to just follow up on that point on what are we missing in this system that actually allows everybody to see what is going on. It feels like it's a very, very complex system and you don't know what influence the choices you're making are going to have. And so how can anybody visualize it? Do we need better models? Do we need better digital systems? What are the tools that we're missing in the background of this to enable us to forecast options?
So the us here is government from your perspective, or?
A company even, you know, so if you're thinking about where does hydrogen fit in, my export market is telling me I have to lower my carbon, they're going to measure my carbon, you know, and add a tax to it if I sell. How do I work it out?
Yeah.
I think it's down to extraordinarily complex modelling that individual parties will make that themselves are just all, you know, educated guesswork. If there's anything we know, it's that, you know, predictions are wrong. I would expect that the complexity of it might outwit many people's attempts to do that. And so therefore to think that you can might be a false and rather heroic belief.
We do need a narrative, don't we?
Oh, it depends who the we is and what the narrative is for what purpose. Sorry,
Yeah,
I tend to think in the sort of much bigger systems. So the Net Zero Australia work, I'm really looking forward to, as I mentioned before. I'm not, so please don't take me as commenting on that, because I'm not at all wanting to cast any aspersions. But what I do know is that in all the conversations I have with everyone, all the experts on every single point is we don't know. So when you add up all those we don't knows, it does make it awfully hard to turn around and go, well, that's the image of the future, because it's also tied up very much in everyone's own wishful thinking. So in the almost 3 years I've been in my role, you know, I've met so many people who fundamentally believe something to be the one and only truth with hydrogen. You can ignore everything else, and everyone's truth is different. Now, in a way, we're a bit of a sort of Schrodinger cat situation where possibly the cat is both alive and dead, and in other various states of, you know, something in between, you know, that the box remains unopened. So I think it is limiting to suggest there is such a thing as a true picture of the overall complexity that can ever be arrived at and be found to be correct. But my God, we need some scenarios. So I look to things like Net Zero Australia, and I just think everyone throw yourselves into something like that as that one data source that, you know, may have its assumptions and qualifications. Again, I'm not commenting on, you know, the decisions that have been taken in the making of it, but having something that gives us collectively scenarios to then form decisions based on our own senses of what we value is the only thing I think we can do.
I'm just conscious.
Sorry, I didn't answer quickly.
We should have had a 2-hour session, which is great. And people in this room, we can stay on to talk. So I want to pick up a question from the Q&A, because we will be cutting off.
So again, I'll just ask, there's many questions here, but there's a question about agreeing with Richard that bio offsets aren't going to work. We're not going to have enough land, but asking whether direct air, carbon capture, storage and use might be needed instead. It'll be expensive and incredibly energy intensive, so don't we need to factor this increased energy demand into the transition? Yeah,
so the short answer is it certainly has to be a focus, and it could well be prospective, and it's certainly worth a huge amount of effort, because we will need all possibilities, and if that's got a remote chance of succeeding, then it should be pursued. And is being pursued. Yeah.
Frank, do you have a small?
Yeah, my question is relative to Richard. You mentioned the sources of hydrogen, talked about blue hydrogen, green hydrogen. I wondered if you had a view about what people now are talking about, the gold hydrogen, which is basically natural hydrogen, and also about brown hydrogen, if you like, hydrogen from coal. Do you have a view about the potential of either or both of those relative to obviously, the blue hydrogen is well established because it's been used for decades in hydrogenation. But what about the other two?
Well, so gold, I don't know anything about.
It's naturally occurring, they're founding it.
Yeah, so if it's naturally occurring, there are free hydrogen molecules sitting out there that are just waiting to be captured, a bit like CO2 using direct air capture.
Like
then I'd say I'm all ears, really. I thought it was so reactive as a chemical that there was very little about that you could capture, but I'd be pleased to be proven wrong. As for brown, look.
Well, I mean, on that point, a lot of mining licenses have been issued in recent times for drilling for it. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, well, I'd be, and that's a case of keep your mind open. As for brown, look, brown without carbon capture and storage, brown with carbon capture and storage, I classify as blue, and that's the only option I think. And I think it is an option in some parts of the world, subject to limitations of carbon storage, subject to limitations of land disturbance for mining, and subject to the fact that there are, of course, going to be some residual emissions. I think the benefit is that storage is the Achilles heel of green hydrogen, in my view. It's an Achilles heel, in the sense that it's difficult to store it at scale on what we now know. And and that is when you're talking about the need to balance to meet seasonal fluctuations in demand for heating, and to do that through wind droughts and through the exigencies of trying to rely upon a weather-dependent source. I mean, even imagine if there was a massive volcanic explosion, not a ridiculous idea, the COVID of climate change, right? And we had depressed wind and solar for a couple of years as a result of particulates in the atmosphere. That could be an energy disaster if we are completely weather dependent. And so to have something which is weather independent that you draw upon in reserve with as a supplement to a fundamentally green system is where it is possible that coal as a hydrogen store, an intrinsic hydrogen store, may have some value, and I think we've got to be open to it. And that, of course, could be completely blitzed by a revolution in storage, and long may that happen too. But I don't think we can count on that at this stage. And just a quick point on the uncertainty. Just one thing I'd say is look at COVID. Chaos eventually resolves to understanding. But it's that process of ideas constantly circulating, recirculating, new research, and people converge on a new understanding of things. And I think that will happen here, but it will happen continuously over decades. So we'll always feel like we're in some measure of chaos, but we will actually be cementing some understandings as we go. What else are you going to do?
That sounds like my experience so far. Yeah.
On that note, what I'm going to do is draw this to a close because we're out of time. But it's certainly, I'm sure, we need to have a readiness talk in another few months or 12 months' time, because this is a very complex area. And certainly on behalf of the Academy, I'd like to thank both Fiona and Richard for what has been a really stimulating and really informative and entertaining discussion. I don't know whether I'm thrilled about hydrogen or just daunted, but we'll get there. Yeah, so I'd like everyone to just thank our speakers. I'd also just like to thank Regina for helping us with our technical, and also Sandra Candish for corralling up the Q&A. So thank you everybody for attendance, and we'll leave there. Thank you very much.